to the next part of our time together. What we'll do is I'm just going to say a few words about Mr. Wayne Clancy, and I do know that Wayne has a surprise for us. So I think everyone will be very pleased with that. Um, you know, I could read Wayne's bio word for word right now, but I'm purposely not going to. And instead, I looked around the World Wide Web and tried to dig and pretend like I'm TMZ to see, hey, what could I find on Wayne Clancy relevant to this event and to help add maybe some more personality to this. And I was successful. So there's some videos about Wayne where he's had different interviews online, and what I've learned is when he was asked, "Hey Wayne, how do you stay focused and motivated?" A healthy habit he went to off the bat was getting good rest and sleep. His favorite movie, Life of Pi, which caters to the story of a positive mindset regardless of the current outcomes. What's really refreshing about Wayne as well is that he's worked with a number of different stakeholder groups. And what we mean by that is not only has he worked with organizations, but he's also worked with communities, nonprofits, as well as government. As a kind of I guess, a mindfulness comment, there was a part where in a previous interview where Wayne had said, I'm going to read this word for word because I think it's very powerful, is that, hey, when was the last time you went with bare feet and rubbed them in the grass? So I think a nice kind of mindfulness comment, and a really nice way to set the tone for us moving forward. So what we'll do, Wayne, is I'm going to unmute you right now. And then Wayne, you can share your screen, and you can also let me know with your other guest, your rock star guest, how you want to proceed with that. So I'm going to unmute you right now.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm so excited to be able to spend some time with you and share some thoughts and ideas. And as Nathan was saying, we also have a guest I'll introduce in a few minutes, who is very, very passionate about the kinds of things that we're going to talk about. And it was kind of interesting. A couple of things that came out of some of the initial conversations and some of the initial points that everybody was making. Great comments by Alan, because we are so aligned, and I think you'll see where a lot of the work that we've done kind of fits in and supports the kind of comments that Alan had about alignment and bringing things together. And what we've learned is that it really is a bit of a combination of what we call art and science to help with the human side of it all. And a lot of times it's been treated only as an art or only as a science, but it's really a combination that makes it all work. And then Jerry's insights into the world of work, absolutely spot on. And I did notice too that Anne spent some time working for McCain Foods. And there was a kind of an interesting overlap there, because I did a lot of work for them as well. And this was back in the 80s when I first created the algorithm I'm going to share with you. We did so much damage to one of the McCain competitors because we were doing culture work back then that was far beyond what the McCain family were doing. But so Harrison McCain, out of the blue, I get a phone call, and at that time he was considered, top CEO in Canada and everything. And I get a phone call out of the blue saying, in his gruff voice, "Hey Wayne, you're going to come and work for me. This is Harrison McCain." And I thought it was somebody joking, but it actually was him. And so I ended up spending some time there, and two key things happened. If you're aware of McCain Foods in Heartland, New Brunswick, the pretty well everyone there works for them, and hundreds of people. And the first time I went down, I'm in the lunch area, and there's like people everywhere, and Harrison and Wallace were there, and people went by, and the two of them knew everybody's name. It was mind-numbing to me. They would call them all by their name, they'd say hello, and they were part of it. And they had created a culture there that was so far ahead of where so many others were at the time, and how that played itself out. And then the other great thing, funny story, is that I did learn, because the McCains had their houses up on a hill, and they had their house, and then each of them had their area where their private jet was, and then their jetway out. And this is in the middle of Hartland, New Brunswick, up on the hill where their road was there below. And Harrison, the first time I met him, I came and picked him up in Toronto, and then I drove him back to his private jet up at the airport. And I learned that when you take someone back to their private jet, you don't drive towards the plane, because he was in the back going, no, you can't do that. You have to drive around and make sure you drive alongside it, just in case your foot slips. So anyway, that was kind of the way it goes. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen, because I don't think you can see it yet, can you?
I'll let you know, Wayne, when we can see your screen.
Okay, so I've just got to figure out where I'm used to being the host. So just got to figure out where, share screen, there it is. Okay. All right, can everybody see the screen now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll go through this, and then we'll share some of our research work with you in terms of how aligned everything is. So we are definitely in a new world, and I think everyone was quite aware of, and I'm just going to save myself a little bit of bandwidth here, and it's not my video. It is a new world, and we're very focused on that. And a lot of what we've learned over the last few weeks is very, very interesting in terms of where things are going from a predictive capability. There is an unknown new normal that's facing us, right? Our business, social, community, political, and societal teams are wondering what's next. And we're hearing that from a lot of people where they've kind of regressed a little bit and into panic mode in a lot of cases. And what are we going to do? What do we do next? What do we do next? And a lot of this is in addition to a lot of the financial stress that so many organizations are facing. And what are some of the leadership challenges that are playing out of this? Well, today's leaders are seeking people visibility through data, but really unsure how to use that quite often. Leadership is embracing data. Human analytics is moving from a niche function in the HR world to a critical leadership function. However, so many leaders still don't really understand how to do it, and are quite often working with analytics that may be old and aren't necessarily representative of the way people are thinking today. Innovation is a team effort. The work I do with John King and his efforts, and he's the part of 1 Million Acts of Innovation. And so much of what we learned is that it is the core, and innovation is not just the big ideas that occur. Innovation is also these little groups. When it's supported by an effective organizational culture, the groups come and have little acts of innovation, changing 1 or 2 things here and there that could really, really help change the way things happen within the organization once they're added up. But so often organizations don't reward that type of thinking. Leadership is leveraging data, right? And the key word here is alignment as well, because leadership teams now have to become more aligned around common outcomes than they ever have in the past. You can't have the different functions working in their silos the way that they have historically. And there's also this expanded view of brand. Brand traditionally has been your customer acquisition, retention, and what's our brand to the marketplace, and how do we support that? But we've seen this dramatic shift over the last few years into the whole area of the internal brand, talent acquisition and retention, and organizational culture and performance, and how that reacts to that, and how that plays out in the external brand. And it really is integrated in so many different ways, and requires that information be brought together. What are some of the key emerging themes that are going on? People are looking for work-life harmony, and a lot of that has been driven by the millennials and the different culture that is being brought in. But what we've learned is it's not necessarily as different as everyone thinks it is. And there's some really interesting things about bringing the 2 different groups together that way. Humanity is central to most conversations, and it's the ultimate competitive advantage. And there's an emerging business case for this, and I'm going to share a little bit of our story in a few minutes on the whole humanity component of this. But it is a big part of the conversation now that's happening. And of course, the emerging case for wellness and resilience. And one of the things we've learned, and when we say the emerging business case, one of the things that we've learned over the years is that most organizations look at health and wellness, well-being, and the humanity components as an expense. They don't necessarily look at it as an investment into how we can work it. And I hear so often from organizations that'll say, well, are our sick days down this year from last year? And to limit themselves into that kind of thinking when they don't necessarily look at the productivity and the impact on the organizational outcomes and innovation and all the different components that occur with that. So it's really interesting that there's this emerging case for that, and people are looking, how do we work in that particular area? And one of the things that we've learned as well, and the research that we've done, is that great data optimizes decision making because it gets people focused on what it is rather than what we think it is. And what I'm going to share with you is what we call a perception model, and it deals with how people perceive things. And human motivation is based upon our perception and what we think things are. And that is correct for us as humans. And when we look at teams, teams will have a perception over how things are. That is the way they believe, and they will respond and act that way. And people can argue that, well, that's not the way it is. But the fact of the matter is, if their perception is that way, that is the way they're going to respond to things. And data can really help people focus on what it is rather than what we think it is. So what's the research journey? And I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because we want to pivot into a bit of a conversation about some of this particular area. And how do we build all of this in with all the different partners that we have as we work through? The whole thing started with what we call the expectation gap index. And the expectation gap index is that. It's the gap between how important something is and how well it's working. And we applied that, and earlier, I think it was Alan that referred to total quality management. And really, initially, this whole system was built as a TQM system for humans. And just to share a little bit of that on how we measure that, what we've done is we've organized all of the different components, and there's a lot of them, and I'm not even going to the detail of it right now. But the core is that we find out from people how important is something to them, and what is their level of agreement that an optimal state is true. And so essentially, the first one here is an agility overview question, and we're able to adapt quickly when things change or they don't work out as planned. How important is that? And what is your level of agreement that this statement is true? And that leads us into creating a gap. And what we do is we have a measurement, and I'm not going to get into details, but if those two were aligned, if it was 100%, yeah, it's really important, and we do it really, really well, the score would be 100%. But if it's really important and it's not working as well, or it's okay, and or we do it sometimes, then it shows up as a percentage of 100. So it could be at 85 or 50 or 60% of what people want it to be. But the interesting part about our model is if it's really not important, but it's working really well, it can be up here as 125% of expectation, right? So it's really that simple of how it plays out. So, essentially, everybody loves the 4-quadrant grid. So essentially we have, items that are important and working really well. Yay, let's support those. We can leverage them because they are important and we're doing a great job in those areas. We also have areas that are important that aren't working so well. So we're going to have low performance in those areas. There's no question about it because it's important, but it's not working well. And it plays out in many, many different areas. Then we got this whole gray area that comes out of some of our analysis. And that's what, maybe it's not important, but we're doing really well. Are we over-resourced? Are we spending too much money in that area? Or do people just not understand why it's important? And do we need to focus some of our efforts on education? And so much of the culture work that was talked about earlier is so critical. But if a group such as, could be a leadership group, could be a management group, could be a lot of others, if they don't think something's important, then they don't tend to put the focus and energy behind it. And that could be a problem, especially if management and leadership is misaligned with what's important to their staff and their team members as they go through. And what's also important is that, and the goal is to get things to move into importance. And it's also important to understand different segments and how people look at things. And there could be demographic differences, such as location A, B, and C. And there may be a different culture or a different requirement in Toronto than there is in Halifax, than there is in Calgary, than there is in Kapuskasing, or there is in North Bay. And it's not necessarily wrong. It could be what is adapted into that particular environment. But so much of our culture work tries to create a one-size-fits-all. And we see some of that playing out with our southern neighbors right now, with some of the division that's going on and the different application of communication style and culture. And a New York culture is very different than an Atlanta culture, which is very different than a Phoenix culture, which is very different than a Los Angeles culture. So it's really understanding what are those different areas and how does that play out. Second one is there's all this conversation around the different generations, the millennials, the boomers, the Gen X's, and how we all think differently. Do we, and where do we, and how do we? And these are some areas that are pretty interesting conversations. And so often we're learning some things too, that there is what's called an emerging boomer right now, which a lot of people who are in the boomer range who are rethinking the way they look in their worldview, because boomers, and I'm one of them, our first jobs were shut up and listen, do what you're told. One day you'll have your manager's job. And it kind of groomed out some of that collaborative environment and some of the innovative thinking that went on. But now there's so many that are saying, hey, you know what, I had incredible opportunities, incredible career. Now I'm open to new thoughts and ideas, which are a little more aligned with the millennials than what a lot of people think. So it's pretty fascinating kind of where a lot of that goes. It's funny sometimes when I'll talk to boomers who say, the millennials are so entitled about things. And it's, and I'll say, remember your first boss? Oh yeah, what an idiot. Oh, and how is that different? So, sometimes we have this conditioning that we can work with when we look at information that allows us to work through those particular different areas. And the different stakeholder groups, leadership, management, team members, et cetera. It's important to see where do we have gaps in thinking. And a lot of times, management applies things based upon the way they think things are, but when they see that they're not necessarily aligned with everything, then, maybe we should make some adjustments. And good data can help do that as we go through. And of course, the different diversity and inclusion capabilities, male, female, and there's a lot of different thinking still within organizations that have dominant activities that are not progressive and not inclusive to everyone that happens to be there. So what's the story? And so we started with that expectation gap index, which is what you saw in the TQ, what we call total quality management for humans. And as we go through, then we integrated that into a lot of different areas. And that included customer, employee, channel suppliers. So we were able to see kind of where that area worked in and where there was overlap. Because quite often you get the customer sat work that's done through sales and marketing. Then you get the employee engagement work, which is done through HR. Then, purchasing may do the channel and supplier side, but at the end of the day, there's so many common constructs that occur within them that, and how do we leverage the strength of our suppliers? How do we make sure we're aligned with our customers? And how do we make sure that our culture is aligned with the outcomes that we want from a customer perspective? Then after we got into some of that learning, after I had that, and just to give you an idea, when I started this whole thing, it was back in my corporate career where I was brought into the logistics industry. And the industry had just gone through deregulation. So the industry was regulated by the government. Everything was regulated by the government. This was in the early 80s, including the pricing. And all of a sudden it was, okay, now you're into a competitive environment. And they had no idea how to do that. So, their idea of a VP of sales and marketing was 6'6" Norm who could outdrink everyone else. There was zero sophistication. And they didn't know what to do. So where the expectation gap came to play was I was in the boardroom with one of the divisions who was a high-tech delivery organization, and Apple was a big customer at the time and some of the others. And they had just done a big customer satisfaction study, and they were way above all their competitors, but their market share was slipping, and they were failing in so many different areas. And, sometimes you can see things when you're not stuck in the mud. So I just said, well, how important is this stuff to the customers? And everyone in the room looked at each other. They'd never asked the question. It was push marketing at its finest. We're great, buy from us. We're great, buy from us. So I literally went away that night and created the algorithm, which was, what is the difference between how important it is and how well it's working? And we went out and talked to the customers. And sure enough, what came back was the customers said, you guys are doing a great job, but it's really not important to us on so many of the different elements. So it was an amazing, we're not prepared to pay for it. And it was really that simple. So what we did was, rather than cut all those things, we invested in education and knowledge, and we had the Apple people educate everybody, and we brought up the importance, and the business turned around in a very short period of time. So it was really quite the interesting component, hence my relationship with Mr. McCain and hurting some of the visions that they had. So then, when we took that algorithm, we integrated it out into the different areas. We created what we call a performance system, where we added all of these different elements to it, because just collaboration or just employee engagement is not enough. What is it? How does that impact decision making? How does it impact agility, strategy, et cetera? So we really broadened that whole story out. Then we spent quite a bit of time, and some of our early customers were the Heart Stroke Foundation, the Mood Disorders Association, if you're familiar with their work. And for years and years, we've worked with Alberta Health and the whole province, and what was going on within the healthcare environment, as well as the wellness and mental health of the employees who were part of Alberta Health. And a lot of really interesting things came up, which I'm going to share with you in a few minutes. Then the community side of the whole thing, when we applied this to communities, we actually took all of the constructs that we had organizationally and applied them to communities. And we've done work with the City of Toronto, where we've measured community culture, where we've measured community humanity and community wellness. And it's really quite amazing where those different elements came out. Then, I had this interesting opportunity where Arizona State University, and I don't know if you're familiar with that, but ASU is ranked as the most innovative university in United States, with MIT being number 2 and Stanford being number 3. And they had identified that they were turning out students who are less socially responsible than the ones they were getting. So they were taking nice kids, turning them into jerks to get a financial result for companies. And they were very concerned about that. They had heard of the work that we had done, so they had asked me to commit. And I worked with their civics group, because they didn't want sales, the business department and the engineering department, their customers were the companies who wanted those jerks. So it was very difficult for them to kind of explore that area. So they pushed it over into civics. And I worked with them, and what we did is we created an empathy model that measures some of the empathy that was going on. And sure enough, the scores were coming back where we had been stripping some of that out of a lot of the young people and rewarding behaviors that didn't necessarily support that kind of thinking. And it was really fascinating work that came out of it. Now, we're still about a year or so away from implementing some of that with them, because they got to make sure that they want to work through, but it was fascinating to me. And while I was there, I was introduced to the Dean of Humanities. And he's kind of in this basement building, a room in a basement of one of their buildings. And ASU is the big, beautiful American university that's got technology, hasn't even been created yet. And he's down in the basement. And he was telling me about this Project Humanity that they had. And I said, Neil, this is such an important project. And he was pushing it out through individuals. And it was really hard to get any kind of momentum happening with that. So, I'm sitting there looking at him. I said, Neil, this is such an important project. Why are you in the basement? And he said to me, because, well, you can't measure humanity. It's only the disciplines that you measure that get the funding to work with this. And to a guy like me, that was a challenge, because for the previous 25 years, I've been measuring these complex relationships. So I left there and I talked with John King, who one of my mentors and the brilliant gentleman who wrote the book Tribal Leadership. We went back and looked at Aristotle, we looked at Socrates, we looked at modern philosophers, and we isolated what we call 14 constructs of humanity. We modernized the language and we put it into our tool, where we started to measure and cross-reference humanity versus and cross-reference that to outcomes within organizations. And sure enough, what we were learning is the higher the humanity scores, the more money companies were making, which is a way of selling that in to help companies understand that part of it. So you can see here, we got the mental health, the wellness, the well-being, the resilience and conditioning, environmental. These are all factors within the models that we have. Then our relationship with ASU and the humanity factor and bringing that in, and the global research initiative we have with them to create a business case for humanity as we move things forward. And you can see here where some of those key components play themselves out in the different areas that we measure. And you can see that the resilience, physical wellness, personal energy, mental focus, and feelings and emotions are all significant factors in this. And when those play themselves out and we compare them to humanity and some of the other different elements of a culture, it's pretty fascinating where we can see and start to bridge that gap between where we're looking at from a wellness and well-being point of view versus organizational performance, and bringing the two together. So after that, we applied it in education, where we've learned things. We've done work with universities that produce nurses, and where we looked at how frequently do hospitals want to see certain skills demonstrated, and how frequently are they seeing them by new grads. And there were some very significant gaps between that as well, because we use the same algorithm. So we were graduating a lot of nurses into our hospital and a high stress environment where they weren't trained well enough, so they had to be retrained, where there's a difficulty in culture and all sorts of different elements that occur with that. We applied mentorship. We're helping organizations understand the value of that, where people can share rather than manage, because there's a big difference between the two of those. We've created all sorts of different partnerships where we co-design, and John's work, what we call, into sustainable stage 4, and what he calls stage 5, which is, making the world a better place. And how do we really look at the strength of what we're all bringing, rather than we're better than you, or we win and you lose. And then we took the systems and we bundle that into what we call our GPS model. And people think of a GPS as something that gets you to your final destination. And what we have referred to this as a global performance system. And our P is not the positioning part, but performance. But then John and I also created something called a global possibility system. And the P works in both of them, where we help enable different groups of people to find new and better ways of doing things. And when we look at organizations right now, we've got all these different themes that are occurring within the organizational environment, and they're all disconnected in a lot of cases, and very difficult to bring together. And what we've done with our work is we brought those together in what we call this GPS. And you can see here that there are all these different elements, and these are just some of them. We've got so many more that we can get into, but we've simplified the process, where we bring people in what we call a checkup, similar to what you would do if you're not feeling well. You get a blood test. And if you're not feeling well, just as an analogy, you get a blood test done, and then you may get a second and a tertiary, and then at some point you may end up at a drug or surgery intervention. But in the business world, we got a bunch of what we call surgeons peddling their surgery without good diagnostics. And we focus very much on how do we really understand what's going on, what people are thinking, and where they are in that particular area. And the core theme here, which you heard earlier too, is around alignment. And getting people aligned around a common outcome doesn't necessarily mean that they agree, but it is getting them aligned about a common outcome, which is something that's missing in so much of the world right now. Is that I'm right and you're wrong plays itself out so often in the discussions politically and within organizations and communities, rather than we're aligned around a common outcome. And then, how do we work towards that together? And yes, we can disagree on that, but as long as we have that alignment, it makes it a far better and more progressive approach to things that is inclusive of others. And you can see all the different elements there that we look at. We also played in on something we call collaboratism, which is kind of a funny little story, because activists play the same kind of game that others do, and we're right, you're wrong, you have to change things. So we coined the term collaboratism, which is to collaborate towards a common vision. And one day our goal is to have that in the dictionary. So just a funny little note on it. And then the Tribal Possibilities Initiative, which is my work with Mr. King as we move forward. And then the GPS, which we explain to you as we go through. So what were some of the key learnings? Now, and I'm going to show you just quick couple of elements of this, and then we're going to go into a different type of discussion as we get to that point. But when we look at the integrated wellness, for example, oops, sorry. So this is a dashboard that we have when we get information back. Now, I don't remember codes very well, so zoom in a bit here. Can everybody see that? Just can you see that okay, Nathan? Just put a thumbs up.
Yep. If I can see it, everyone should be able to see it as well.
Okay, so you can see here, this is what we call one of our dashboards that people will normally log in to see, and our customers do that, and our other partners do. And you can see here that we've got all the different areas, but we've got performance, collaboration, teamwork, humanity, and then some of the different well-being components. And this allows us to kind of work through and have all of them in the different together in the same kind of a dashboard. And we have that capability of drilling down into these and looking at them in much greater detail. So for example, from people practices point of view, and this particular one is not a lot of different data, but you can see that it allows us to look at the different areas as we go through. John and I created something called the possibilities checkup, and this is where we invited large numbers of people to come in and work with some core components and look at how does that work, and let's do a checkup for the organization. And you can see here, this was an organization of 116 people, and you can see here where some of the scores came out, and you can see that there was challenges and engagement were not where they should be. And we were able to look in and we look at the different areas, and clarity came out in 70% as a very significant gap. The members of the leadership team make the short and long-term strategy clear to team members. So no one really knew what they were supposed to be doing, which is an interesting thing because leadership so often gets disconnected from the people that they're responsible to and don't really know what's going on in the marketplace. Even though they are within their work area, they guess, but they don't necessarily know. And a lot of times they don't know if the clarity that works with them in the boardroom, is that playing itself out through all of the different members within the organization. And you can see here why that had a 70 score was because, as we can go down deeper into the data from that end of it. And we can see here that it had a 91 importance score, right, when it comes to the data, but the performance was only 61. So the gap was roughly 30 points, which is why it's at 70% of expectation. If these two numbers were reversed, and it was only a 61 importance, but it was working at 91, this would be 130 score, which means it could be over allocated, right? Which makes it that simple. So when we go back and we look at some of the different areas, so from the possibilities checkup perspective, so that kind of gives you the context of how that plays itself out. Oops, wrong one. So you can see the different areas that are interrelated, and then we consolidate those into what we call a single report, and the single report takes the 10 key elements and puts the 10 lowest scoring elements and puts them into a single grid. So you can see here, we don't listen well to our customers. We don't have clarity from the leadership team on our short and long-term strategy. We're not focused. We don't manage our information well. We're not communicative. And in the work we do, clarity is what we call a causal factor. If it's not clear what we need to be doing, then we're really never going to be focused. We're not going to understand our customers as well, and we're not going to manage information, and we're not going to be as communicative. And a big part of this would be we need to focus on this initially to get clarity in our communications as a leadership group before we can actually work in some of the other areas. Because if you show this to a leadership group and there's 10 people in the room, everyone gets one of these to go and examine, right? Rather than us looking at it collectively and how the interrelationship works with them. So that gives you an idea from that end on what that works. Now, and we've got all the different areas that we can look at, and I'm not going to go into great detail, but this is the humanity model, and charity and generosity, compassion, diversity, empathy, fairness, forgiveness, etc. But the language we use is very modernized, and it works with people from an integrity point of view. And we did a big project with the city of Toronto where we measured community culture and we measured community humanity. And the scores in the city program came back significantly lower in our community scores than they did in the organizational scores, which absolutely blew me away because I grew up, mom would open a door and say, be home for dinner. And I grew up in Toronto. Mom would open a door and say, be home for dinner when I was a kid. And your community was your safe place. Then everybody went to work. Now your safer place is your business and you go back to your community. And it was fascinating to me where some of that disconnectedness has occurred over the years as we work through those particular elements. The last little while, and I'm just going to share this and then I'm going to introduce somebody to share some thoughts and ideas with you. We did a city possibilities checkup, which I'm not going to get into, but we did what we call a pandemic checkup. And we've been going out and talking to people, and this is one organizational one, and asking them, what are some core strategic elements organizationally? What are some of the human elements overall? What about character and humanity? And what about wellness? And we asked them to tell, how are things now, right today, as we're working through this whole pandemic issue, and how were they before we got into this? And it was fascinating because you can see without surprise that so many of the different elements from a strategic point of view dropped very significantly now. Like from an agile point of view, we need to be agile, but we're not. We're not focused on our customers, very significant drops in these areas. We're not purchasing well. We don't really know what to do. 10-point drop in strategy. We don't know where we're going in a lot of cases, or we need to rethink that. We're not making decisions well. We're not very efficient. Our brand is taking a hit. We're not managing costs very well. I mean, these are all obvious things that go with it. But the other part that was really fascinating in this whole thing was a lot of the humanity scores are going up. We've been hit with this incredible, this hit organizationally and from a community point of view. And we're seeing now that people are being more, there's more charity and generosity happening, that people are feeling more compassion for others in a lot of cases. Diversity and inclusion is going up, empathy, fairness, in terms of how we approach things are going up. And one of the interesting ones is in as we go through all of these different elements. So they're almost all increasing. The one that isn't, which is interesting, we constantly demonstrate self-control and restraint because people are losing their temper, they are showing frustration and playing it out, and that's what we're learning. But outside of that, the humanity scores were going up significantly. And the other part that I think we need to be very wary of is look at the drop in wellness. And we're seeing this play out in all the different areas in the consolidated data. So we have a really significant issue that's going on right now. We had one before where we had wellness was an issue in organizations with burnout, a lot of the different elements that are going with it. But you can see in our checkup where some of these scores are happening now. Sleep, where people are not being able to fall asleep, 15-point drop between the two of those different areas. Restfulness, sustainability. So these are all some key areas that are dropping very significantly as a result of this issue that we're going into. And just some of the different thoughts that came out of this and things that we're learning was, this what will be whatever this new normal is as we come out of it and as we arise out of it is going to be pretty interesting for us because we don't really know what a lot of that is. Organizations are looking to pivot a little bit now and saying, we may have 3 days work from home and 2 days work in the office, or 2 days in the office, 3 days from home. And what is that going to mean, and how is that going to play itself out? And is that the best thing necessarily to do, because humans have been so trained into those interactive components of being together? And what is that going to end up looking like? And I think organizationally, we need to be very, very careful as we move forward, because a lot of this is going to play itself out in very difficult ways. And, I just want to bring that to everyone's attention that we may take another really significant hit when it comes to that particular part of it. Now, I'm going to share something with you in a few moments, but very quickly, if anybody who's interested right now, if you could take 1 minute or take 2 minutes and go to this link.
And I'm going to type that in the chat box as well.
Okay, so mindsuite.2daysmood.com. And what you'll see is a dashboard like this, and it'll ask you a couple of questions. If you could, maybe just answer those questions. And how are you feeling right now? And bored isn't here, but you can put that in if you like as a comment. I'm kidding. Okay, and then it's going to ask you a few questions. Now, can people just put in chat a thumbs up when they're finished or something like that? I'm not seeing my chat, Nathan, but if you can let me know when a lot of the people have done so I can.
Yeah, and even for timing, Wayne, feel free to move forward, and that way we also can allocate some time for some Q&A at the end. But we definitely put the link, and then when we email out the slides after, we'll also include that same link in that post email.
Okay, so you can see here that this is all in real time, and this is showing. This is 2 Days Mood is one of our operating offerings here. So you can see the scores that came out of this particular group, and being able to go into more detail and see how it plays itself out in real time. And this is really an interesting opportunity for organizations. And we're offering right now during this pandemic time, any organization that wants to use it can use it to get some of this feedback from their team who are out in the field and in the marketplace. So that just gives you an idea on what that looks like. So at this point, I'm just going to shift a little bit into what we call creating possibility stories. And I was given the wonderful opportunity, and I've referred to John a couple of times, wonderful opportunity of meeting John, who has become a mentor of mine and a co-creator and a co-conspirator and all that kind of stuff as we go through. And John wrote a book that did a lot of things. And it was a New York Times #1 bestseller, but it also was recognized recently by a study that was done by Inc. magazine and some universities within the United States on what is a must-read for emerging leaders. And in that particular study, the #1 book that came out was Good to Great, which pretty well everyone has read and knows about. But the #2 book that came out was John's work in tribal leadership, and which is amazing when you think about it. And John, and I was going to show you a video here, but I'm not going to, and I'll tell you why in a moment. And John asked me not long ago to work with him to write the follow-up, and we're calling it Tribal Possibilities. And the work that we're doing together. And what we're doing is we're mixing. When John and I first met, we had this great conversation. I was down in Arizona, and we had this great conversation on the phone. He was in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And 45 minutes later, I said, John, I'll hop on a plane and come up and see you. He said, no, I'm coming to see you. And he jumped in his car. He drove the 6 hours down to the house and stayed for 3 days. And we whiteboarded a lot of his work and the metrics that we had and everything. And we realized that we had a blend of the art and the science that was something that was pretty amazing. And so now that we're working through, we're bringing that together into what we call Tribal Possibilities, which is where we bring culture along with some analytics and things to go with it. And I'm so pleased to share with you right now that John is, rather than you watching a video, John is actually here with us. And maybe if we could unmute John, I'll stop sharing my screen. Or if we could unmute me, could you put John up, Nathan?
Yeah, so John, you should be able to speak any at your leisure right now.
Okay, thank you, Nathan. So that was a lot of dense information and brilliant stuff, but you know, I'm not that guy. I'm not the data guy. I'm a guy who is interested in relationship. If I work with people that are in the real estate industry, what I say is that you have to understand that you're not in the real estate business, you're in the relationship business, and your vehicle is real estate. And your vehicle is relationship. And it's true no matter where we are and no matter how we operate, because we're human beings. So what I'm interested in is how do we get human beings working together, and quite specifically in partnership, working as partners. I have spent most of my life studying this phenomenon called partner. And what I've discovered is that nobody seems to understand it, except from the point of view that most everybody seems to think that there is such a thing as a senior partner and a junior partner, and that's not so. That's just simply not partnership. That's master and slave. And for the person who is in the senior partner designation, uh, it makes no difference to them. Everything's working, they're cool, everything's fine. So they move along. But what we know about master-slave relationships is the only one who truly understands it is the slave. And so that became kind of the base point of me taking a look, because I was, at the time, I was lecturing at the University of Southern California in several of the colleges. And so I was in the Marshall School of Business, I was in the Price School of Public Policy, and I was in the Annenberg School of Communication. And I was kind of like, if it was baseball, I was just kind of a utility guy. And they would just kind of stick me in, and maybe I would hit a single here and there. So but what I saw was that I was being put a lot into organizations that were ineffective, if not the culture being toxic. And out of that, over time, looking at it kind of anthropologically, if you will, I began to see that there were various stages of ways that people work together. And over a period of observing this and gathering data for about 9.5 years, working with about 24,000 people, and maybe upwards of 90, I think it was 87 different kinds of organizations. Some of them were public, some of them were private, some of them were nonprofit, some of them were for-profit. They were all over the place. And when I looked at them, I began to see that there were certain commonalities. I saw that people fell out in two particular ways. One is in how they language themselves. So they talk a particular way, and people inside of that language group all kind of share a mood or an attitude or a point of view. And I saw that there were 5 of those particular areas, of which, when you look at it, the working numbers are stages 2, 3, and 4. And so just to kind of say it right off the bat and get at it where the kind of the meme of it is, stage 1, we don't deal with them a lot. You might, but we don't deal with them a lot. Mostly these people are incarcerated or they're institutionalized somehow. These are people we call undermining. And these are people who have an alienated point of view. And the way, if you throw a net over everything that they say, because they talk, and they talk a lot, but if you throw a net over it, what they're really saying is life sucks. And they're committed to that. So this isn't your 16-year-old son walking in and saying, Dad, life sucks. This is somebody who is committed to the notion that life sucks, to the point where they become the Unabomber at some point. Now, that's not us. And that's not who we're generally dealing with. Stage 2 is you and me on a bad day. Stage 2 and me, 2 is a place where we are ineffective. So how we language ourselves when we're being ineffective, if you throw a net over the whole language of that, is my life sucks. It's not that life sucks. It actually is my life that sucks. If I had your, and then fill in the blank, if I had your curly hair, your money, your connections, and connections is really the key thing here, my life wouldn't suck, but I don't, so it does. So that's you and me on a bad day. Stage 3 is you and me on a good day. And stage 3 is a person who things are going well. They're winning. And in their winning, they have a particular way of languaging, which is not life sucks or my life sucks. It is, I'm great, you're not, and I have the stats to prove it. And they pretty much are interested in only one thing, which is being dominating. So that is when I discovered that, I discovered the fundamental master-slave kind of languaging place where people hang out. And since I teach in leadership academies around the world, in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia, in Central Asia, and in Russia, what I've discovered is this is universal, that around the world, people are joined in language in their own way. Inside of my life sucks, being in relationship to I'm great, you're not, and I have the stats to prove it. And in fact, neither one of them actually knows who they are if they don't have the presence of the other. So they are literally looking for it. And at stage 2, there's a perennial, I'm the victim of the circumstance going on, and a perennial kind of assigning of the cause of why I am here. And at stage 3, it's the kind of the perennial, I'm great and I'm entitled. And I'm entitled because I am better than you, like literally better than you. And then I saw that in every organization, there were a small but quite effective group of people that were at what I ended up calling stage 4. And stage 4 are the people who we are great together. And what I found is they weren't talking to each other. So they were getting ground down and beat up. But we are great together are people who were successful at forming stable, effective partnerships with people who were aligned on something. And what they had consciously done is they had moved from the zero-sum game of stage 2 and 3 into a non-zero positive outcome game where we're all in the same boat together and we're all up to something that is worthwhile. So that became stage 4. And when I saw that, I saw, well, that's exactly what we really are looking for. If you're a manager, you're interested in getting people out of stage 2 and 3, because I will tell you that virtually all organizations are toggling between stage 2 and 3 on a day-to-day basis, which is why that mood index is such an important thing. And what can we do is we can take them out of that place where they are thrown. They have been trained that way by our culture and by our educational system to be competitive and to be somewhere in that measure of between stage 2 and stage 3. They form groups that have a particular structure to them. And when you look at the structure and you listen to the language, you get very clear at, oh, these people are operating at 2, or they're operating at 3, or they're operating at 4. And what I saw was something really, really interesting. Every once in a while, people get engaged in something that has them operate at an elevated level and has them take on some kind of project. Usually it's a crisis. So we're in a crisis position right now, and this is not at all, which totally explains why people are actually starting to be nice and being nicer to each other. But where people take on some kind of crisis or opportunity where they, in a sense, make history, where they create a new culture for themselves. And that's what stage 5 is. So partnerships come together and work out whatever they have to work out. And they don't have to be in agreement, but they are in alignment as to this is a worthy project. In fact, this project is so worthy that it's worth failing at. But they take that on and engage in something called stage 5 work. So when I saw there was stage 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it was linguistic, and when I saw that there was stage 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it's structural as well, I began to be able to look at people in how they interact with one another and how they were interacting with people who were in a hierarchical kind of situation, how they were in a flat organization. And I could begin to see when people are actually operating in an authentic way that was forwarding the action. And in that, I saw that, oh, there are common values. When I came into this conversation, I came in just before Jerry was speaking. Alan was doing the speaking at the time. And I was struck by your commitment to really getting at the heart of what's up in the world of core values. And I will tell you that at stage 4, what I see is there are tons of values that are present. Essentially, they are grounded in an environment of dignity and respect. And they are values that people have that are not, they're not sharing the values, but they're harmonizing with each other. So if you think in terms of a musical note, a note, or you think in terms of a musical chord, when you're working with a group, you're trying to get a harmonic or the whole chord going, not everybody singing the same note. This is good to understand. And so our work, when I met Wayne, I will tell you, I knew there was something in this. I didn't get it. And I will tell you very frankly, it sounded like gibberish, but it sounded like there's something inside of this. I need to get him translated into something that I can understand. So I got in the car and I drove over to Scottsdale to hang with him. We spent a great 3 days with each other. I don't know that we slept 4 hours during that entire time. We were on the whiteboard and we were excited because we were beginning to see all of the places where my stuff mapped into his mapped into mine. And being a person that does what I do, I had been looking for a tool that could be an effective measuring tool for over 25 years. And what I had found is tons of tools, tons of diagnostics, but they were exactly the opposite of what I needed. I will give you a couple of examples. DISC profile, the Harrison assessment, Myers-Briggs. All of those have their value, but what they do is they show us the difference between people and how we can operate with people in their differentiations. What Wayne's algorithm shows, and where the gold in the algorithm is it shows where diverse people come together and what they have in common, and by extrapolation, what they're committed to together. So when we're working with them, we can actually measure them and then find the easy way and baby steps where we can get people working together, because we know that when we get people working together, they begin to develop relationship. They begin to generate an environment of dignity. They actually operate with mutual respect. And what happens in terms of the measure is that between stage 2 and 3, where we're driving it and it's in survival, and we're in survival because we're measuring against time, and time is a diminishing resource and we never have enough of it. It's always going away. Instead, we're in a realm where it's not the craft of management, but it is the actual art of leadership. And the art of leadership is, since there's only space and time, leadership is about space. Leadership is about creating and generating space for people to flourish and work together. And it's about generating the environment in which people can make mistakes and correct. And that allows us to get back to what Piaf talked about when he said the organic way of growth is play the game, learn the rules, correct. And we are highly, highly acculturated to learn the rules, then go play the game, and then make somebody wrong. So our system has to do with leadership. It has to do with creating space. It has to do with respect and dignity. It has to do with encouraging people to develop virtue, because virtue forms character and character unfolds destiny. And we're all interested in destiny. And so how we go about it is by creating space for people to thrive, but to make mistakes and to correct and to coach each other and work each other in a state of authentic partnering. That's what I have to say.
Thank you, John and Wayne. doing a time check right now. We have 10 more minutes. Would you like to proceed with going to Q&A or showing additional slides or any sort of other comments?
Wayne?
Oh, sorry, I thought I was muted for a sec. Let's go to Q&A if there's any questions for John. I know I've asked him a few thousand of them over the years.
Okay.
Within the group,
So what we'll do is we'll get started with
they can
one of the
join it.
questions. Yeah, we'll get started with one of the questions. Wayne, you can give myself back presenter rights. I'll share my screen again. And what we're going to do is, Alan, I'm going to unmute you, and it'd be nice because I know you asked a question. You can ask the question to Wayne in your own words right now. So feel free, Alan, to ask the question. And everyone else can ask their questions as well in the chat feature.
Sure, thanks. Wayne and John, phenomenal information, and the sort of human element. You know, it's interesting because it kind of reinforces you know, some other metrics that I've seen. So as sort of the human scores go up, so too does organizational performance. So one thing that struck me is that you're saying that despite the overall increases in the human element scores, and I was a little surprised to see that, although, you know, there has been certainly an increase in, you know, respect and fairness and all of that, and helping people deal with situations, but overall wellness is down. So I guess the human element scores are up because of organizational factors, but the overall wellness is down because of individual factors. You cited lack of sleep and stress and those sorts of things. Is it fair to say that wellness would be even worse off if the other human elements had sort of not increased? Like, I would have thought that the increases in the human elements, albeit more organizationally driven, would sort of benefit the overall well-being of the individual. But that doesn't seem to have translated in terms of the overall sort of wellness quotient, if you will. That's a long-winded question. Does that make sense?
It is. I think what I'm hearing is, and John could comment, but I think the simple one is that when it comes to sort of the humanity side and how people are responding to this with some of the fellow workers, there's a sympathy to it. There's a little bit more empathy potentially playing itself out. But the individuals are all feeling an accelerated amount of internal stress. And from what we're learning, it's coming from a number of different places. One is the fact that they're not going to work the way they used to, and the way that they've been conditioned into for a long time. A lot of them are stuck at home, which may or may not be a good thing, depending on how that plays itself out. And then there's the stress of not being able to interact with other humans the way that they have traditionally as well. And there's a bunch of other things as well. So I think the two elements, the good news is that we could leverage that because maybe people are opening up a little bit to treating each other differently and a little bit in some different ways. The part that is concerning is that if we have mental health issues that drop, maybe even the increase in humanity isn't going to help us with some of the wellness factors, because the emotional component is a very significant driver. John, did you?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that I want to say. Alan, I just love your point of view. I have to say that. When I tuned in at the very tail end of when you were speaking, and I wished I'd been there from the very beginning. There's several kind of things that I think are at play here. One of them is the magnificence of the human spirit. That in fact, we are in a time of crisis. And we are in a time of great fear that is being exacerbated, certainly in the media. And in addition to that, we're doing something that is extremely unnatural for human beings, which is we are separate from one another. You know, the work of Edward O. Wilson around ultra-social human beings as an ultra-social being really is being tested here. But what I see is the magnificence of the human spirit saying, no, we're not going to get knocked down. And what we're going to do is people are digging in, Alan, and they're looking inside for the first time in a long time. One of the great raps on people and culture and the times right now is that we're living at such a pace that it's all on the surface. And in fact, you can really make a case for that. But here we are where it's slowed down and we've been separated from each other, and there is just the incessant raining of conversation and opinion and assessment and judgment and point of view in our media and in what we've got out there, that thoughtful people are going inside, and they're beginning to separate or distinguish out. On the one hand, we have excellence. Excellence is kind of like a jacket that you put on. It's kind of like something that people have spent their lives being trained in the model that is learn the rules, play the game, become excellent. But they have defaulted to the organic. If you watch children, they've defaulted to the play the game, learn the rules. And it's a scary game, but they're playing the game, learning the rules. So they've gone inside, and inside what they're tapping into is, instead of now what we're going to be doing is we're modeling greatness, we're actually going to be accessing excellence. We're going to be accessing greatness, the greatness of human being. That's why I say the magnificence of the human spirit. I am pulling for the internal conversation. And I know you are too, because just who you are and who your group is. And so I say that that's our job, is to partner up and be doing what is going to get underneath the magnificence of the human spirit, and having people get in touch with their sense of greatness. And I often say, when I'm teaching, I say my job is to set people on fire and then pour gas on them, because that's what we're up to here.
Fantastic. Thank you to Wayne and John. And then we'll do one more question here from Tiffany. And this question is for Jerry. So Jerry, once I read this question, I'll then unmute your mic. And that is, Jerry, the CCOHS current values co-creation journey. What are your thoughts on a data-centered process? So Jerry, if you give me a moment here, I'm going to scroll down to your name and I'll unmute you to share some light on that question. Go for it.
If I understand, Tiffany, your question about a data-centered perspective, everything is based, especially in our field, on data. We receive data from our, from our employee engagement surveys. We receive data from our inquiry service on how we answer questions to Canadians, our responses. We receive data on how financially and fiscally responsible we are. And I think part of that phase two, Tiffany, is where all of that comes together. The reality of what we are and what we think we are versus how others perceive us might be a bit of a rude reality to us. And I think part of an interesting experience was there's a tool that CCOHS has developed for senior managers, for CEOs, on and a series. It's almost like a questionnaire on where you think you are, in this psychological health and safety center, and how you think you've scored. And it's interesting. CEOs think they're a lot better than they really are, and it was a bit of a reality check when they went through this exercise and said, "Wow, I've got some things to work on. I thought I was being respectful," something like Wayne was talking about and John. I thought I was being supportive. I thought I was, when in fact, no one is there to tell them any differently. I'm not going to say anything to my boss. I'm not. So this exercise is really offered everybody kind of into a level playing field, and we use the data to make the decisions. And I think that is Tiffany, I think that's a critical point, is that we're not just speculative, and we're not just, making decisions to spur of the moment, but in fact it is very, very targeted and based on very specific information and evidence-based. That's the word I was looking for. So that we can all share that in fact the information is correct and is value added.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jerry. What we'll do right now, we've hit our time limit, so we're gonna end things right now. We will send all links, relevant links, in a post email, including this evaluation link, which was still included in the email which shared the link for this meeting. But to everyone who was a part of this, who made this possible, to all the OWHC's board members who also make things like this possible and other aspects of the OWHC possible. I'll end on a note to tie this back to our main topic of building sustainable workplace programs. Maybe it's a matter of digging deeper. So Wayne and John shared specifics on all these different areas. How specific are we getting? Maybe the word mental health isn't specific enough, and we can start using words like feelings, humanity, and so forth. And then a comment Wayne said about continuing the story. So employee engagement for what? Health and safety for what? So maybe by continuing the story and really telling people, hey, this is important because of this, to help with the business case and perhaps with the long-term impact. So with that said, thank you to everyone for your time. It's because of you we can exist in the first place and share our vision. And as well, like we said, we're going to send an email afterwards with the slides that were shared, the evaluation link, and then we'll figure out an effective and efficient way to hear from Anne as well. So to everyone again, thank you for our 2020 Joan Burton Day of Learning.